Much and welcome everyone. And as Cosette said, I'm Patrick Kelly, so I manage learning instructional design here. And one of the things we do in the Taylor Institute is support the teaching and learning spaces within the Taylor Institute itself. So we'll show you some pictures of what the Taylor Institute, or what we refer to as a TI, as we go through. And Darcy Norman, you want to introduce a quick introduction?
Well, okay, I did. Yeah, so Patrick reports to me, so I get to be Patrick's boss, which is fun. Our team, the Learning Technologies and Design team, it's a kind of a cool hybrid team where we're half 1 foot in instructional design and 1 foot in learning technologies and learning spaces. And we work with instructors who are designing courses and help support that, as well as helping to run the learning spaces and the online platforms that form our online learning environments. So we spend a lot of time thinking about space design, whether it's physical or digital, and the impacts of space design on teaching and learning, and vice versa. How do we inform the design of our environments based on the pedagogical activities that take place within them?
Move us ahead.
Oh, no presentation?
Presentation mode, please, sir.
All right, presentation. There we go. We have an actual slide deck, so we're going to keep on topic. We've been through this part. And I think this part. So this is actually the atrium of the Taylor Institute. If anybody's been to the Taylor Institute at the University of Calgary, it's right in the center of campus, right next to the Student Center. It was opened in 2016, so it's been a while now. When it opened, it was the shiny new building on campus, and so it was used for all the fancy events and everything. And the shine is kind of worn off a little bit, but it's still, I think it's actually about right now, where we see. You'll see in the photo there on the main floor, there's actually doors to 6 active learning classrooms of different sizes and shapes. And they're used by instructors from across the university, from all 14 faculties. And we have, we'll share some of what they've learned, but that's really see. So this is what students and instructors see when they come into the atrium of the TI.
And we do want to start off by acknowledging where the University of Calgary is situated, located in the heart of southern Alberta. We acknowledge and pay tribute to the traditional territories of the peoples of Treaty 7, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. An interesting story about, we had an elder in the building many times, but one of them at one point said and gave the feedback of, the building is interesting, but it's also, what was his wording?
Very sterile.
Sterile. I was gonna say cold, but it's like, it is very sterile. Like, it's just, where's all the connections? We have lots of windows to the outside and we can see the land, we can see the environment around us. We also had a decolonization reconciliation course taught by Workman School of Education in this building, in one of the rooms, and the instructor gave us a feedback of, I could not have done that course in any other space on campus because of the flexibility and also the ability for students to see outside and have natural light and be together in a very, I guess it's like an emotional topic that they were talking about. So that's one little, we'll put some of these little stories in as we go through what it's like having these classrooms and what we've learned from instructors teaching in these spaces.
What was kind of neat, so that was an Indigenous instructor who was taught one of the first courses in here, and normally she was assigned the basement classroom in the education building. So cinder blocks, old, not feeling well, and her and the students were saying because of the way they felt in the learning spaces here in the TI, they actually approached the conversations in the course differently. So it's kind of interesting to hear the effect literally from instructors and students on how that affected their teaching and learning.
Right. And as we go, we'll share some more stories of what it's like being in this building, but also we want to hear from you. We have not Jamboard, we have Padlet today. We have a Padlet activity set up to learn from how everyone is teaching in different spaces and what those spaces might mean to you. So we're going to present a framework of how instructors, students, and the learning space interact with each other to give us a groundwork, a framework to have further conversations about teaching in these spaces and learning from each other. So what are learning spaces? Let's move ahead.
What are learning spaces?
What are they? And there's many definitions out there on what learning spaces are. And this is also in the literature, but in general, we have traditional learning spaces, which is what we know as the large lecture theaters, fixed seating in the classroom. Most of the time, the students face the front of the room where the instructor stands or sits. That's sort of the standard traditional learning space. We also have what we call active learning spaces, where furniture is often on wheels or can be rearranged and moved around, which has advantages and disadvantages, what we're learning about this in the TI itself. But it also has lots of technology and multiple points to interact with that technology and with each other, students and the instructor in the space itself. There's lab spaces. I guess that PowerPoint didn't get finished generally. It's just a general space, and as we know, lab spaces are usually students are in small groups together. We have off campus, where we also refer to as field classes, field trips, workplace settings. We know that Office of Experiential Learning and experiential learning in general has quite a big place in Alberta right now. So we have lots of emphasis on creating experiential learning opportunities for students, whether it's at the university, on campus, or in the workplace itself. And then there's the informal spaces, which I think we often forget about when we're talking about learning spaces, are things that aren't classrooms, where students can get together, gather, and interact with each other and the material they're learning in courses, and continue learning on where they go. Those are some of the spaces. We're just going to use those in general for today.
And some of the stuff we're going to touch on is sometimes there is maybe a disconnect or some friction maybe between the pedagogical intent of an instructor and the space that they're in. We actually had a case in the last day where an instructor was assigned to teach here in the Taylor Institute, and their pedagogy was lecturing, and they were really frustrated because that didn't feel good in the active learning classrooms, and they had to spend a lot of time basically turning the active learning classrooms into traditional learning spaces, rearranging the room, and then having to reset it after. And so that kind of disconnect. And we're not saying one is better than the other. There's a place for both pedagogies, but it's finding a learning space that meets the needs of the pedagogy and learning spaces that are informed by the pedagogy.
I actually had an email from a student in one of those classes today asking me, when is the classroom going to be put back in groups so we can do active learning? And that's from a student in the spaces. I thought that was very interesting. So a little bit of background around research and writing into the interaction of learning spaces and teaching and learning. I like this one from 1977. We can go way back in time. This summer started looking into that relationship and found that these microclimates exist within the classroom. And I think we see that within, especially these flexible spaces, because things happen in certain places in the classroom, but also maybe in the more traditional classrooms as well.
Well, the microclimate connects too. So especially in an active learning classroom, you come into it, where's the front of the room? There's a microclimate that tells where the instructor should stand and where the student should. So those microclimates teach you what is expected of you in the space. And being aware of that is super important.
Yeah. And one of the big things that we find in this building, talking with instructors, but also in the literature, is that the space does influence what happens in that classroom and what goes on. And just that example of Darcy sharing about the instructor wanting it being in rows, that influences the space and what the teaching and learning happening in it. Having students sitting in groups influences what happens, because we talk to an instructor and say, students are already sitting in groups. They're already talking to each other when I come into the room. Why not continue with that during the lesson? And that interaction with the space is quite interesting. There's quite a bit of research gone into it, especially around accessibility, a sense of belonging in that space, which goes down to the fine details of what colors are the spaces being painted, what pictures are hanging on the wall, can you have natural light? That interaction is really interesting. I think this Will et al. From 2020 from UBC did a research on where students sit in the room, right? And I think humans, as just by nature, we always sit in the same spot, but there's reasons why students might sit near the back of the room. For safety reasons, they want to be the first out to get to their next class, so on. But they found that the students who sit near the front outperformed those students sitting at the back of the room. And actually every row you went further back into the room, grades actually had they were a bit smaller as you went back in the
Right, but
space.
it's hard to imply correlation or causation on that, right? Do the A students pick the front row because they're A students, or are the A students because they're in the front row? So there's that for sure.
That was
I always sat in the back row of the lecture hall just because I could lean my head against the wall.
Yeah.
Things like that.
We're also finding that the discipline itself uses spaces in different ways. And a flexible classroom like we have in the TI might not meet all disciplines. And Darcy has the reusability paradox to talk more about, but one space is not going to meet all needs, especially in the future as we talk more about the like a flexible learning space, flexible classroom, and meeting students where they're at in different environments, like being able to have a hybrid classroom, for example.
So the reusability paradox comes from David Wally. It's from the learning objects, reusable learning objects discipline. And it's basically, if something is able to be reused in various contexts, it's not particularly useful in any individual context. So as you make things more generalizable, they're less powerful or useful in any specific context. I was able to co-teach a graduate architecture course last semester. And so it was graduate students, and the whole point, it was a work integrated learning course. The whole point of it was, what if architecture students were able to design learning spaces that were informed by pedagogy? What if a classroom wasn't generic in that the same room does math and chemistry and English and dance? What if the room was actually, the room itself had pedagogy? And so they did some amazing projects on there. There's maybe a separate presentation, but it was cool. That really deep investigation of what does this reusability paradox mean when you've got rooms that are so generalizable that they're not really useful in any specific context. So I always come back to Marshall McLuhan, and I mean, the big one is the medium is the message. The medium in the case of learning spaces is the space that we're in. And the message is the space tells you what is allowed, what's expected, what your roles are probably going to be, who has power in the room. And that is as important as the course syllabus. The room implies a syllabus. Culkin summarized McLuhan's work. We shape our tools, and thereafter they shape us. We design our classrooms a certain way. And after that, they shape what happens in the rooms. So it's very important for us to be mindful of that power. We have an ability to design, support, enable these learning spaces, and be mindful of what that means, of what people perceive of themselves when they come into a learning space, and what they think is possible, allowed, important, valued. And those connections are super important. Again, this is old stuff going back to the 60s. So we're talking, stuff that's over 50 years, almost 60 years old. Holy smokes, time.
We like old stuff.
We like old stuff.
Yeah. I don't know why.
I don't know. When the TI opened in 2016, I was just starting actually my PhD research. And the main reason I wanted to do that is we realized our learning spaces, not ours, active learning spaces, we didn't have a really good way to describe what was happening in it. We could describe things like community of inquiry that looks at the text transcript of what happens. There's classroom community scale from Rovi. They don't get the whole thing. And so my PhD research basically produced this framework that I call the teaching game. Well, there's links at the end. But it's based on using concepts from the design of video games to describe teaching and learning. The aha moment was during COVID, where online courses basically felt like a video game. So I was talking with my supervisors, and they're like, well, cool, we have ways of describing video games. What if we use those methods? And so I used those and interviewed some instructors and analyzed some courses and came up with this framework that describes the interplay between the player, the people in the space, the performance, the things that they do, the narrative, the pedagogy, the content of the course, the environment, the space that you're in, and the system, which is the rules, the context, the institution in which it all takes place. And so it's the big picture of this. There's a lot of stuff in here. There's about 290 pages of a dissertation. There's a link if you want to go to that. But we've come up with a way to really kind of simplifies that when we're looking at learning spaces and the role of instructors and students.
Right. So the smaller picture, and I haven't actually read Darcy's
What?
work yet. Sorry, Darcy. But I came up with the smaller picture based on what's in the literature, been talking with Darcy. And so the three elements we're going to focus on today is really the space itself, the learning space, the student, and the instructor, and what that relationship can look like. Because whether we're teaching in the classroom in the Edna group, or we are supporting instructors in that space, and in what they're doing in their instruction, the space does play a key role in that and what they think they can do. And there's also all the other pieces that go in, like number of students, but it also says, well, if you have a lot of number of students, you're going to be in a larger space anyways. What does assessment look like in different spaces? What does student engagement look like? What's my role as the instructor in that space? And what can I do to engage students in those spaces, which is what we'll be talking about. And we have those Padlets set up to get and learn from you, everyone in this room, about how do you use these spaces. So thinking about those three as they overlap and the learning experience in general. For example, one of the instructors I was talking to when the TI first opened would say things like, the students gave me feedback. They were talking about, it feels like the space was made for them. That one really stuck with me, because when they come into these learning spaces, there's no real front of the room. There is students sitting in groups, and in actually some of the community that was built just by having it configured in small groups was quite impactful, because the students, we even had an example of students, they would come ahead of time. They would sit outside their space or come into the space, and they would talk and they would do things. They would form relationships even before the class started, which was quite interesting to hear, because we'll give you more history of the space itself as we go.
There's that kinesiology course. So amazing kinesiology instructor had this course that she's taught for years and had low enrollment. People weren't coming, they weren't engaged. She started teaching it here in the TI, and she was saying just by the students being able to sit at tables and face each other. So take the technology out of the room. Literally, you're just coming in and sitting with each other. She'd come into the classroom when it was supposed to start, and the students were so actively engaged with each other, talking about, their weekends and whatever too, but also talking about the course. And that was really amazing. So she said she noticed the enrollment went, or the attendance went almost to 100%, and all of the students were actively engaged with each other and with the course. And that was the same course, just moved into a different space that felt like it was hers.
We had a similar experience with the education course. There was two sections, so it was actually really interesting to compare. At the same semester, the instructor would teach one section over in a building, a cinder block, no windows. It's like the basement of the education building, I think. No windows, very inflexible room. And then she taught the other section in the TI. And enrollment or attendance was one thing she noticed would change in the cinder block room. Enrollment or attendance came down, whereas in the TI, it stayed at a sort of relative state throughout the semester. And she just had this comparison that was really interesting to hear about. All right, moving on. A bit more history about the Taylor Institute itself. So Darcy mentioned, it opened in 2016. At that point, when we opened, we used an application process for instructors to teach in the building. It was almost like writing a grant application, right? But it was like, tell us why you want to be in the Taylor Institute. Tell us what you're going to be doing. Like, what are the pedagogical reasoning for wanting to be in these flexible classrooms? But also, how are you going to share it back? How are you going to share what you've learned back to other, like your colleagues, or take it back to other rooms that you're teaching in? Because not everyone can teach within the TI. So we have these 6 rooms, and there's a picture of one. When it was still shiny, brand new, there's a picture of the classroom, I should start saying learning space, but the room that has groups. It has these big screen carts throughout that students can connect to and display. And in active learning mode, if anyone's seen that before, you can have one display showing to the entire room, so students can, as a group, can share their work to the entire class and so on. But there are these technology-rich learning spaces that we have, 6 of them.
And there's photos of the other spaces. If you go to that URL, the Taylor Institute /about/spaces detail, dash detail, there's photographs and details of all the spaces.
So over the time, we have migrated from that application-based system to working and collaborating with the registrar office to fill the spaces up, because they needed the space. At first, we were working maybe 60% capacity, which had its benefits. Because there was usually a half hour or an hour block of time between classes in these spaces. And that time was actually used. A lot of the instructors would hold sort of these impromptu office hours after a class because they weren't getting kicked out of the space. Another class wasn't rushing in. They had time to sit back and talk to students about things the students were wondering about, struggling with, and students had time before class to just come in and talk.
When we first opened the building, we were scheduling the active learning spaces as dry labs. And so the capacity is scheduling capacity is lower, is 60% is the requirement versus 85, I think it is for traditional classrooms. And so that meant there were these gaps. And instructors were appreciating that because this building is centrally located, they didn't have to go from here back to their home department to have office hours. They had different kinds of conversations with students because they could do it here.
Yeah.
We've changed the big change we've done for that, we've realized shockingly, when people have to do an application process, there's a filter. People feel, oh, I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy of teaching in there. I don't have time to work on this. So there was basically a self-filtering. We've worked with the office of the registrar, so they now completely schedule our stuff, which has the benefit of anybody feels they can teach in here really easily. It's just a checkbox when they're scheduling the course. I would like to be in an active learning classroom in the TI, and boom, they can be in here. The maybe downside of that is they may not be intending to do active learning. So that's where we get that disconnect where, oh, I'm trying to do my lecture course and it doesn't feel good, say in the photograph here. How do you lecture in that space? There's no real front of the room. People may or may not be facing you. And so there's that slight disconnect. But our capacity has gone from about 60% to probably 95%.
Pretty full.
It's intense, which is great when everything works, but if some of the tech fails and we need to get, so not having padding between, we lost the office hour potential between classes. So there is definitely some downsides, but we're getting way more utilization when we simplify the process.
And the other, what we also do is we get a list from the registrar's office before the semester begins. I get an email. I send out a welcome message to all the instructors, giving them, hey, here's what these spaces are. We offer orientations on using the space, on the technology. Most people are interested in the technology in terms of getting help with it, but they just want to see the space as well. If they haven't been in the TI, they're just like, I just want to come in, walk around, get a feel for the space. Where am I going to stand? The interesting feedback we've had is like, where do I stand? There's no center in the room. How do I make eye contact with students on a flat floor configuration when students are looking away from me at a monitor, because that's where the PowerPoint presentation might be displayed.
Well, the big thing they want to know is you can see on that's the teaching podium at the front of that picture. There's a little screen off to the left side. That's the Crestron control panel that drives the room. They just want to know, what do I touch to make it do what I want to do? So there's a lot of, well, there's different modes of the room, and this is how you control the audio and video. So there's a lot of that. And once they're over that, they're like, cool, I can figure this out.
Yeah, and so in supporting instructors in these spaces, the conversation often starts with, oh, show me the technology, but then they also talk about, oh, what does it mean to have students sitting in groups? What happens if they've never taught in these spaces before? They're curious about, well, what activities can I do? Well, what about assessment? Because I can't do my regular old, say, midterm in this configuration. What do I do there? So there's many conversations about course design, about teaching and learning in these spaces that spawn just from seeing the room and talking about the space.
Well, the technologies that are used, yes, they're tech-rich rooms, there's big fancy screens and all of that stuff, but probably one of the most used technologies is just whiteboards. We have whiteboards that are mobile, they're on wheels, they can be moved around the room, so each group table actually has a digital display and a whiteboard with all the markers, so they can do what they want. We've had courses where they've actually taken the whiteboards and made basically forts around the group. So they made their own little mini classroom. So they're able to really reconfigure the space, but it's the whiteboards that really seems to drive a lot of the collaboration and sharing.
Wheels have revolutionized
and wheels
higher education. Can you?
Absolutely.
So we have quotes from instructors who have been in these spaces before. Just let you read those, but just to emphasize some of the things that are being said. I think it reinforces what we've been talking about, trying to imagine what can work best in this space. And going back to that diagram of the space, student, instructors, and the interaction between them, and what is the space saying about what teaching and learning is going to look like in this space. Technology was a big one. Like I say, when most people come to look at the space, they want to know about technology and and get comfortable with it. And it doesn't have to be, they get anxious, but they realize, as his quote says, it's not the focus of being in this space is the technology. It's like, we're going to start small and we're going to build on it as we go. We don't need to do everything right off on the first day. You're going to say something.
Yeah, some of it is I think the root of it is instructors can be scared, right? This can be intimidating coming into a space like this. Oh, I need to be an expert in the technology. What if the technology doesn't work? You know, they don't want to look like an idiot in front of their students. They want to make sure it's all on. Also, when you're teaching, you're in the thick of it, right? So your troubleshooting ability is diminished from what you would be normally. If something goes wrong, you can pause and take time. When you have 50 students all staring at you, your ability to troubleshoot is lower, and so they're stressed. And once they get over that, they really start to think differently about, oh, how can I think differently about my course and my teaching?
Right, let's move on. So just a few more quotes to look at, and really for me, the second one stands out. I use new strategies. And when we're thinking about teaching and learning and not being in these spaces, trying new things, and Darcy said, like, these are like labs for teaching and learning. We're here to help and come up with and brainstorm ideas on what to do in these spaces. And some instructors really take it and run with it. And trying new things and learning from it is really important, and sharing it back to other people, but also taking it back to different spaces. Like group work, for example. We had one instructor who's like, group work is so easy in this space because students are sitting in groups already and they're talking already, they're making relationships already. And then they also taught in the lecture theater. And they said, I remember them saying to me, I'm going to try it. I've never tried group work in a lecture theater, but now I'm going to try it on a small scale. So those are impactful learnings that are now going out across campus from within the TI.
So maybe a potential downside of that. So Patrick talked about the microclimates before, and with the groups, we've seen as students come in, they get their usual seat, right? And they form groups that may become almost teams through the semester, which can make it hard for people that may or may not have a reserved seat, right? Where do I sit? Where is my seat in this space? Do I intrude in a new group? And so we've had instructors kind of play around with that. Do they randomize who's sitting at each table? Just kind of break those rigidity almost, to where people get really comfortable, which is good if you're going for long-term collaboration within a small group. But if you're looking for that across the entire class, you need to sort of push against that friction a little bit.
Yeah, and these other quotes really speak to a little bit about, I see it as the idea of ownership, but also control. We talk a lot about control in the room, who has that. In a traditional classroom, it's really about the instructor at the front of the room, whereas here, in these flexible spaces, that it's more about, I think, that control. And that's one of the reasons why I think people get nervous about being here in these spaces for the first time, is like, oh, I can't, there's no front of the classroom. I don't have that eye contact. It's not all about standing at the front of the room. And the whiteboards. The whiteboards were a big one. As one instructor was saying, well, students would take that whiteboard and make it their own, right? Like that was their little space, that microclimate in this room. They would sort of hide it from other students. They would protect that until it was time to share with the entire class. And the group work aspect in these classrooms are really interesting. And the idea that students are resistant to changing their groups, like the instructor wanted them mingling, is, hey, we're going to rotate groups. It's like, oh no, we don't want to be doing that. Again, that microclimate. We even had one case where students who wouldn't come very frequently to class would show up and feel like they weren't included because they weren't in a regular group. And they had to be invited into the space and into a group to be part of the class. And it really speaks to me about the relationships and the strength of relationships that form in a group setting. All right.
So sometimes when an instructor or a student starts a class in the active learning classrooms here in the TI, it's almost getting to the root of what is teaching and learning. It's about power, it's about control. As an instructor shares those and students take on power and control with it, it can be uncomfortable. They may not be used to it. They're used to sitting in a lecture hall where students have no power or control. Instructors have it all. And that shift in relationship can be very uncomfortable for the instructor that may be losing control of the class, and the students who are now having to teach themselves. So there's that discomfort. As they get past that, amazing things happen, but that transition can be really difficult.
I think we spoke to many of these things already, in terms of what we've learned about being in the spaces, except, being transparent with our own decision making. We have a working group within the TI for the spaces, but that working group also involves a representative from our comm media, or the people who would support the technology in the spaces across campus, from IT, from the registrar's office, and we make decisions within how can we use the spaces in the TI, and then learn from that to spread that out across the university in general. Like the registrar's office said, we need a bigger space, an active learning space for 50 students. So we combined 2 rooms because they have walls between them. We combined 2 rooms into 1 for this semester to experiment. Does this work? And does it meet the needs of the university in general? So we want to hear from you and give you an opportunity to think about what spaces you go into, what you learn from teaching in spaces or learning from spaces. So we have 3 sort of the general spaces on campus here. We have a large lecture theater, we have a smaller seminar style room, then we have an active learning classroom that's in the Taylor Institute. And there's a Padlet. Please go to that Padlet. In that Padlet, you will find, I'm going to bring mine up here, basically those 3 ones, but just brainstorm. We're going to give you about 5 minutes, and we'll keep these open as well. But for this part of our time together, brainstorm, what do these spaces say to you? It can be 1 word. What are they saying to you? And I see people coming into Padlet. And there's also one about the field, out in left field. Are there other spaces that you want to mention that we're just not capturing here? But I want to be able to have you take these away to use anywhere else. You can use these Padlets in other places as a takeaway. Fill up the cup. Yeah, students with passive learners. I have seen group work done in a lecture theater. It's chaos, but it's really cool to see.
Shut up and listen. Yeah.
Natural light is a big one on research into spaces itself. Just having natural light has a huge impact on student attention and motivation of being there. So I like anything else too. We have libraries, we have the online spaces. Yes, we have all those other ones we haven't really got into because there's a lot of different spaces out there. Interesting that most of the comments are going under lecture theater.
There we go. Oh, there they are.
Being a number as first year undergrad. Oh yeah, think back to when you were a student even. That's really good just to think. Like, honestly, those lecture theaters haven't changed when was the university built? Like in 1960 that they were built, right? They haven't changed. They put new seats in and stuff, but the general dynamic in their room has not changed in that amount of time.
I found an archival photo of that lecture hall from like 1970 or something, black and white photo, where there's like students smoking in the classroom kind of thing. Aside from that, it looks exactly the same. They've added a projector, the screens are the same, everything is the same.
This is so good. Okay, under the active learning classroom, what am I expected to do here? I think that's actually quite true. A lot of, even for first year students across the board, like what's going on? We still find that university students first year have a certain expectation on what university is supposed to be like, or graduate school, or not graduate, but post-secondary school. And there's quite a resistance to active learning, as you probably know. There's a resistance to, oh, what do you mean I gotta teach myself? Like flipped learning. I'm just here to listen. That passiveness is ingrained in what higher education is all about, at least within a university setting.
Well, that overwhelming for sure. I mean, students know how to play the game of being in lecture. I know how to sit for 50 minutes, take notes on the little tablet arm. Nobody bug me. Don't ask me questions. I'm just going to be here. And they know how to do that. They get into a room where that's not the norm, and it can be uncomfortable. They don't know how to do that. And especially you see like the normal straight A students, you know, the typical students that know the game of going to class, they struggle a little bit at first because it's a different thing. They've got to sort of give up. I was good at this, and now I've got to actually participate and do. I don't know what to do. So there's that, again, that disconnect sometimes.
Oh, can draw on the outdoor mood. Sunny day, snowy day. yeah, like really trying to be in touch with our environment. Place-based learning is, I hear that term quite a bit as well. Is on the opposite side, I had an instructor teaching a film studies course, and they wanted blackout blinds because the shades that come down just kind of, take the edge off the sun that's might be shining in. They wanted to make the room dark, and like this is the darkest it's going to get. Another one, we have a larger room called the forum, and that is actually, it has a seating that can come out like bleacher style and seat about 300, 350.
360 in there.
In flat floor configuration, it's about 130 students. But they taught a history course, but it was history in well, it was music. And he's like, can you play audio in this room? I'm like, sure can, but it's got a really good acoustics in it because it's like and the audio system is like state of the art. And he's just like, this is great. And 9 o'clock in the morning, he had the room vibrating with music in it with the students, and we loved it there for that reason. Okay, these are really good ideas. I think the general sense is there, but it's also really sparking some interesting thoughts about what it means to be in these spaces, because we still have them, and some of the challenges, but also the opportunities in there. Had an engineering instructor who said, he was assigned a course. It was mostly a theory-based course. He was assigned an active learning classroom. He's like, no, I want to be in a lecture theater where I can make eye contact with all the students, because it was a bit more of a passive course. And that really speaks to the need of being in the space that is best suited to how the instructor wants to teach. And this instructor was all for active learning. But he said, no, I know this course needs to be in a different space to be most effective for me and the students.
Should we move to part two?
Let's go to part two. Okay, those are really good. Now we've got you're thinking about the different spaces. What do you do in those spaces, right? We've highlighted some opportunities, some challenges, your thoughts about what does this space speak to you, but how do you engage students in those spaces? We have the same spaces, but the question is different at the top. Do the Padlet. Start generating ideas of, if you are teaching, you have experience in those rooms. If you've just been in those spaces, you've heard about those spaces, you've supported instructors in those spaces, what goes on in those conversations and in your classrooms when you talk about, how do I use this space? How do I engage students in them? People are coming.
Yeah, creating engaging, people dump on lectures. Oh, we shouldn't be lecturing. We should only do active. There is a place for good lectures. Like storytelling, powerful storytelling can be amazing learning experience. So we need places where we can do that. So lecture halls are, I think, always going to have a place. We're finding they're not the only place, and that's cool. But absolutely, creating these engaging lectures, not just reading bullets off PowerPoint slides, actually telling stories, I think will always have a strong place.
Yeah. We get a lot of requests for digital presentations, or formerly what we call as digital poster presentations, but we just call them digital presentations. So students aren't no longer fixed to doing like a printout poster. They can do an interactive poster on the carts, on the screen that you see in the classrooms, and they can do presentations that way. And it's quite a demand, actually. Imaginative reasoning in a seminar room. Yeah, so sending back and forth to the students, a flipped classroom. Yeah. Not that we want to stereotype a room for a purpose, but it happens because you see active learning in a large lecture theater, but it's in a smaller scale. Think pair shares, right? We have these peer learning, we have top hat or classroom response in these lecture theaters, where in a smaller classroom you can have more voice, you can have more discussions, and it's easier to make that happen.
So there's a comment on the lecture theater about high flex. So how do we bring say Zoom or Teams, bring video conferencing into the classroom, have remote students and in classroom students? And that can be super powerful. The challenge we have is, how do you make the remote students visible in the classroom so they're not just disembodied voices or not having voices. So how do you actually show the students who are remote in the classroom and vice versa? And so there are ways to do that with better camera systems, with having multiple displays. So you can dedicate one to just showing the remote students in the classroom, but that involves adding more displays. Not all classrooms have technology that can do that, but it's something to work on for sure.
In the active learning classroom, now that active learning classroom has a lot of windows in the TI. Not all active learning classrooms have windows. So windows are they're almost like a separate entity when it comes to talking about learning spaces. But the one point in here, all the windows can be distracting to some students. Very true.
Yeah.
We have quite a gaining traction at the University of Calgary here, work with neurodiversity. And how do we engage with all students and provide a classroom space or a learning environment that is supportive of all students, and the inclusive design of a course. Very true. Yeah. I find myself staring out the window a lot because that's what I do. I've always done it.
We had the opportunity to meet with our student union executive council, talking about learning space designs and what students are advocating for. And there was a strong focus on neurodiversity. 3 of our students union executives openly disclose as neurodiverse. And we're talking about what does that mean? And for one of them, he said he has ADHD. And one of the things, he needs to be able to fidget. So we have a project where we have these little fidget devices in our meeting rooms, and we're going to be adding them to other spaces across campus. Just being able to do something with your hands lets you focus. He was also saying he's had courses in the TI and the windows were so distracting, he couldn't focus, right? So things like the instructor being able to bring the blinds down to reduce that kind of distraction. One of the challenges we have is the interior walls of the classrooms are glass, so you can see into that atrium. People walking by, sitting, studying, whatever, and it becomes very distracting. So we're looking at ways how can we let the students and instructors have control to bring that down, to block the distractions somewhat.
You know what? When people
Patrick and Darcy,
fidget
just
devices,
gentle
yes.
reminder, you have just a couple